In this episode, the 7 key ideas from the energy section of The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter ZEIHAN. ZEIHAN proposes that the current state of energy, especially oil, is crazy. For example, there's an oil deposit 2 miles under the floor of the Caspian Sea where the production facility is often hit with 60-mile-per-hour winds and entombed in several feet of ice. From there, the crude is pumped 1,000 miles before it is hauled 8,000 miles to Japan. This is an extremely dangerous, risky, and expensive oil production facility known as Kashagan and joked about as cash all gone. It is one case of the delicate energy systems that can function only under the current world order. The energy section of this book tells us 2 things: why this cannot last and what is coming next. The first key idea from the energy section of this book is that America was a victim of its own energy success. After World War II, the U.S. Navy guaranteed the global oil market in an economics for security trade to contain the Soviets.
We call that Bretton Woods, and the basic idea was that we will subsidize your systems, we will patrol the oceans for everyone, we will guarantee all of your security so long as you are on our side versus the Soviets. We basically told everyone in the world that geography no longer matters because we will take care of it. And so countries that lacked a good geography and didn't have navigable rivers, and didn't have large chunks of arable land so they could feed themselves, all of a sudden could participate in a global network that they didn't have to fight for.
This Bretton Woods order made America so prosperous that by the 1970s, American energy demand outstripped production. Much like the gold standard, so much success actually brought failure. Something had to be done. The second key idea is the real price of oil. In economics terms, oil's price is inelastic. That means if it costs more, people will keep buying it to do the things they need to do to make the money to buy the oil. It's not like when the price goes up on some other items that you can choose to go without. You must have oil. Yet, oil's supply chain is fragile, and its transport routes are complex and long. Think of cash all gone, where the crude is pumped 1,000 miles before it is hauled 8,000 miles to Japan. And given the global spread of the oil supply chain, oil's inelastic prices can impact everyone, everywhere. Normally, globalized goods with elastic prices quickly mellow out because distant competitors will see prices rising and enter new markets. But inelastic oil prices reverberate. The third key idea is the evolution of American oil. Inelastic oil prices do reverberate. However, ZEIHAN expects that America will be uniquely positioned to buffer itself against global oil prices. Recall that in the 1970s, American oil demand outstripped production. That has changed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq stopped their oil and pushed prices from $10 per barrel to $150 per barrel by 2008. This high price drew new entrants to the oil market. Those entrants developed shale oil. This shale revolution made America prolific and enabled American net oil independence. Ultimately, America evolved from being a net importer of oil to becoming the world's biggest net exporter. The fourth key idea is that oil is irreplaceable. At the moment, oil is irreplaceable. The green backups of solar and wind are limited to places with lots of sun or wind. Hydroelectric and nuclear power are out of fashion with the politicians who allocate money and pass laws for infrastructure. That leaves us with oil. And oil processing is highly specialized. Oil crudes vary widely, like the grapes that make wine. There are light sweet crudes and heavy sour crudes, and a range in between. Each of these requires a refinery specially tailored to a specific crude. Some refineries are specialized beyond a specific crude down to a specific oil field. And there's more to oil than oil. There's also natural gas. This is an actual gas which is difficult to contain and transport and can be explosive under pressure. It is mostly transported via pipe, which requires tighter economic links between producers and consumers than some other forms of transport. This makes natural gas less reliable than irreplaceable oil. For the USA, natural gas is an abundant byproduct of shale oil, and it is very likely that we will be using both oil and natural gas for a very long time. The fifth key idea is that green tech is doomed. Climate change is happening, but we are dependent on oil in many ways that technology and politics can't beat. We need oil for petrochemicals, for everything from medical equipment to tires. The next alternative to oil for these products is natural gas, a byproduct of oil. Other alternatives for making these products will most likely 10x the price or 10x the carbon footprint. Even if we try to move to green tech, the tech must be matched to an appropriate geography for exposure to sun or wind. And while fossil fuels are so concentrated they literally exist in a physical form, green tech requires spreading out over space. Try using a small set of rooftop solar panels to power a high-rise building where peak energy usage occurs after dark in the winter. It just won't work. And there is so much more to going electric. ZEIHAN points out that the grid for that electricity is carbonized, and all of the world's electricity only generates as much energy as liquid transport fuels. Therefore, to offset all liquid transport fuels and switch to electric vehicles would require a doubling of electric capacity. Even then, the grid would need to be sufficient to transmit all of that new electric energy. ZEIHAN recommends concentrating on greening the grid before we expand it. A switch over to green energy has difficult practical aspects. On-demand electricity is possible through dispatchability, which is the power plant's ability to ramp output up or down to match demand. With solar, the supply and demand are mismatched. Again, think of the high-rise building with peak usage after dark in the winter. With all of the problems with green tech, ZEIHAN estimates that places with perfect geography might be able to reduce their fossil fuel demand by about a dozen percentage points. Pushing green tech beyond that could mean quadrupling the price of power. For supply chains, oil is only one supply and transport system, but green tech would require 10 more, all vulnerable to piracy, all needing much more complex material inputs. Even if all of this could be solved, there is a financial issue.
As the babies boomers retire, we're not only losing them as the single largest chunk of our labor force, we're also using them as the single largest chunk of our financial capacity. Mm-hmm. Now, when you start a power plant, a green tech power plant, one of the great things about it is if you can get the financing, the rest of it is easy street, because 2/3 of the cost is just the installation. There's no fuel, that's free, that's the sun, that's the wind. So the financial tail of it is very small. So you borrow up front, you basically prepay 10 to 20 years of your power bill, and then you're in the clear. Mm-hmm. Fossil fuel systems are different. The facilities themselves are relatively inexpensive. It's only about 20-25% of the total life cycle cost. The cost is the fuel, and that's roughly 60% of the total. Well, assuming that they're equivalent, and that's a different conversation, but let's assume for the moment that they're equivalent. A wind turbine needs that upfront financing. Well, people talk about how if you increase the cost of financing by 50 to 100 basis points that a project fails because then the financing costs are too high. We're talking about a world where we're going to increase it by 500 to 1500 basis points. We're talking about a fundamentally new, different, tougher financial environment. And in that environment, very, very few solar and wind systems will be financed by the private market. And for everyone that the government does, that's something that the government is not doing somewhere else. So we've got a financial crunch just around the corner next year that starts and will not let up until we have a large generation in their 50s to generate that financial boost again. That will be the boomers, that will be the millennials, that won't be until the 2040s. So we're going to have a big period in the middle where this is just going to be very hard to do.
Green tech requires much more financing up front, and that's harder to come by. In its current state, the electric grid is insufficient. Green tech is insufficient. It will struggle in most geographies for lack of wind and sun exposure, and it is hard to finance. The sixth key idea is that batteries aren't enough either. In theory, batteries could solve problems with intermittency and dispatchability. However, batteries face issues with supply chains and scale. According to ZEIHAN sources, Los Angeles, the American city with the most aggressive plan for installing grid storage, doesn't anticipate reaching 1 hour of total storage capacity until 2045. And that's for the current rate of usage. To realize universal electric vehicle adoption would require double that storage. Los Angeles and California in general is the punching bag of this section. ZEIHAN sources show that California's green tech efforts are tripling power prices rather than quadrupling power prices only because California is importing fossil fuel-derived power from other states, but using creative accounting to list such imports as zero carbon because the carbon was generated on the other side of the state line. California aside, ultimately, the storage capacity necessary for a carbon-neutral power system would exhaust the lithium ore of the entire planet. Before we get to ZEIHAN's projections for where this is headed, let's consider some other perspectives. Where should we look next? The Practical and Philosophical Argument for Fossil Fuels in Fossil Future by Alex Epstein, or The Green Tech Optimist View in Abundance by Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler? Comment below. The seventh key idea is that fueling the future will take us backwards. The USA will not have a protracted energy crisis. It is the world's second best geography for solar installation, best for wind, and its shale oil wells produce natural gas as a steady byproduct. China, however, is vulnerable. Rapid growth has already stretched its electricity system to max capacity and rolling blackouts. ZEIHAN concludes that given the craziness of oil and the problems with alternative energy, the world will soon go with less energy, deindustrialize, decivilize, turn to burning more coal and wood, and actually increase carbon emissions. I'm Brad Carr. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And those are the 7 key ideas from The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter ZEIHAN.